The Invasion of Kiska. Did you know that during World War II, Japanese forces occupied a remote part of the United States? The invasion of Kiska was a shocking event that caught America off guard, revealing vulnerabilities in its defenses. This barren and weather-beaten island in the Aleutians saw fierce battles and extreme conditions that pushed soldiers to their limits. So, how did the Japanese manage to hold Kiska, and what dramatic events led to its eventual recapture by Allied forces? Well, let's see. The Japanese occupation of Kiska occurred between June 6, 1942 and July 28, 1943 as part of the Aleutian Islands Campaign in World War II. This campaign unfolded in both the American and Pacific theaters, but what triggered this sudden focus on the remote Aleutian Islands? Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States quickly recognized its vulnerability. The Roosevelt administration, concerned about another potential strike on American soil, made homeland security a top priority. The Aleutian Islands, due to their close proximity to Japan, appeared particularly susceptible to attack. This chain of roughly 150 islands extends westward into the Pacific Ocean, with some islands lying just 750 miles from the nearest Japanese military base, closer to Japan than to Seattle, Washington. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Alaska's defenses were woefully inadequate, with only 6 functional aircraft and 21,945 military servicemen dispersed across the territory. Separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, the challenges of movement, communication, and coordination were immense. This dire situation spurred the commencement of a critical road-building project in April 1942, just 4 months after the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, spearheading the Japanese efforts, had grand ambitions to conquer the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan launched assaults on several Pacific territories, including Malaya, the Philippines, Thailand, and Burma. In June 1942, the Japanese turned their attention to the Aleutian Islands. Regional naval officers directed Japanese forces to bomb the American military base at Dutch Harbor, resulting in over 100 American casualties. Within a week, Japan's Northern Area Fleet seized the islands of Adak and Kiska, marking the first occupation of American territory since the War of 1812. The Aleutian Campaign began abruptly, with undetected carrier-based Japanese planes bombing U.S. installations at Dutch Harbor on June 3, 1942. 3 days later, Japanese forces landed on Kiska and Attu, 2 remote islands in the far western reaches of the Aleutian chain. On Kiska Island, the initial Japanese invasion force of 550 men quickly grew to sustain the occupation. They established a robust naval installation, including a submarine base, seaplane base, and protected anchorage at Kiska Harbor. The Japanese Imperial Army garrisoned 3,500 men at Gertrude Cove and swiftly built infrastructure, including roads and telegraph wires, linking forces throughout the island. They heavily fortified the island with an impressive array of anti-aircraft weapons, particularly concentrated around Kiska Harbor at North Head, South Head, and Little Kiska, which wreaked havoc on low-level U.S. bombing missions. At its peak, Japanese forces on Kiska totaled more than 7,200 men. Even though Kiska and its neighboring island Attu, which had been overtaken just 2 days earlier, were part of the remote Aleutian Islands, they were still American territory. Interestingly, although the Japanese faced little resistance when capturing Kiska, one man managed to evade capture. Senior Petty Officer William C. House, part of the Kiska detachment, escaped and survived for 50 days by eating earthworms and the island's sparse vegetation before finally surrendering. His weight had dropped to a mere 80 pounds by then. While artist Tomoharu Mikami was commissioned to create a painting celebrating the Japanese conquest of Kiska, it also brings to mind the image of the Japanese troop futilely searching for the elusive chief petty officer. Despite their barren, mountainous terrain and notorious weather, think sudden dense fogs, high winds, heavy rains, and frequent snowstorms, Attu and Kiska didn't seem to offer much military value. Yet, Japan seized these volcanic islands. Why? Some historians suggest it was to divert the US Pacific Fleet during their attack on Midway Island. Others think Japan believed holding these islands could stop the US from using the Aleutian chain as a route to invade Japan's home islands. Americans were stunned that Japanese troops had taken over any US soil, no matter how remote or barren. There was also a fear that Japan's occupation of these two islands might be the first step toward an attack against mainland Alaska or even the US Pacific Northwest. Despite nationwide outrage, American war planners initially paid relatively little attention to the Japanese garrisons at Attu and Kiska. They were still recovering from the Pearl Harbor attack and were focused on building up forces in the South Pacific and preparing for war in Europe. In fact, during the first few months after Japan occupied the islands, the US military only conducted occasional bombing raids from nearby Aleutian Islands. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers adapted to the extreme conditions on Attu and Kiska, with the Japanese Navy ensuring they were well supplied. However, by January 1943, the US Army presence in Alaska had surged to 94,000 soldiers, boasted by several newly constructed bases on other Aleutian Islands. On January 11th, troops from the Alaska Command landed on Amchitka Island, a mere 50 miles from Kiska. By March 1943, US Navy Rear Admiral Thomas E. Kincaid had established a blockade of Attu and Kiska, severely restricting the flow of supplies to the Japanese occupiers. On March 26, Japanese ships attempting to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Attu were spotted by US vessels, leading to the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands. Although the Japanese fleet outnumbered and inflicted more damage on the US fleet, they suddenly withdrew after several hours of fighting due to low fuel and ammunition and the fear of US bombers. Following this battle, Japanese soldiers on Attu and Kiska, now virtually isolated, were left with meager supplies sporadically delivered by submarine. Taking advantage of these conditions, the Americans prepared to land troops for ground combat against the Japanese garrisons. In May 1943, US forces launched Operation Landcrab, landing on Attu and eventually destroying the Japanese garrison there. While the fierce battles on Attu were largely overshadowed by the concurrent US campaign in the jungles of Guadalcanal, Americans celebrated when this small remote US island was finally reclaimed from Japanese occupation. On July 29, 1943, Japanese forces on Kiska executed a bold escape plan. They wired Kiska City with demolition charges, destroying supplies, ammunitions, and buildings. That night, US battleships patrolling Kiska were diverted by radar blips they mistakenly interpreted as a Japanese evacuation fleet. In reality, the true evacuation fleet of 8 warships entered Kiska Harbor. Within 55 minutes, over 5,000 Japanese troops boarded the vessels and silently slipped away under the cover of darkness. Still unsure if the Japanese had vacated the island, American and Canadian forces executed an unopposed landing on Kiska on August 15, 1943, securing the island and concluding the Aleutian Islands campaign. The U.S. 7th Infantry Division, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment of the 10th Mountain Division, and the 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade from the 6th Canadian Infantry Division landed on opposite shores. The Canadian regiments included the Canadian Fusiliers, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Rocky Mountain Rangers, and the St. John Fusiliers. This invasion also marked the first combat deployment of the 1st Special Service Force, an elite unit of American and Canadian commandos. When Allied forces stormed Kiska on August 15, 1943, they braced themselves for a brutal fight. Nearly 35,000 troops landed, expecting fierce resistance from what was thought to be a much larger Japanese force than the one they faced on Attu. Initially, the plan was to invade Kiska in the spring, but the attack was postponed to gather the necessary resources for such a significant operation. But here's the twist. They weren't met by enemy fire. Instead, they were greeted by a handful of dogs. Among them was Explosion, a dog originally belonging to the captured Kiska Aerological Detail, who the Japanese had cared for during their occupation. Despite these surprising signs, Allied commanders couldn't believe the Japanese had completely abandoned the island. They were convinced there had to be some trickery involved. For 8 grueling days, troops searched every nook and cranny of Kiska, firing into the dense fog. Unfortunately, this led to tragic friendly fire incidents. One notable incident occurred when a Canadian soldier mistakenly shot at US lines, thinking they were Japanese. This confusion led to a friendly fire tragedy, resulting in 28 American and 4 Canadian deaths, with 50 wounded on both sides. As if that wasn't enough, progress was continuously hampered by mines, timed bombs, accidental ammunition detonations, vehicle accidents, and booby traps. The chaos reached a peak when a stray Japanese sea mine struck the USS Abner Reed DD-526, blowing off a significant portion of its stern and killing 71 personnel while wounding 47 more. And that's it. Now we want to hear from you. What other hidden stories of World War II intrigue you the most? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories.